What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Wrestling with Johners. This is episode 125, and today is another retro pay-per-view review. We're going to be looking back to 28 years ago, believe it or not, to WWF Summerslam 92. Now, why, you ask? Well, I've got a special guest via Skype. I've got Rob from Podmania Wrestling Podcast. So first of all, Rob, good evening. Great to have you on the Wrestling with Johners podcast. And I think that you were the one that approached me about potentially doing a retro pay-per-view. Well, firstly, hi and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this all week. A chance to review one of the great pay-per-views and certainly one of the great matches. So yeah, like I said before to you when we were off air, getting back and looking at all the wrestling history is something that I really, really enjoy. So the chance to do this, I'm very excited, John.
Yeah, so I was kind of bouncing ideas back and forth with you as to what we to talk about on this week's episode, and I think I suggested maybe doing a poll where we put 3 pay-per-views up for people's votes, so kind of a listener's choice, you could say, on the Johners Facebook page, and you came back to me with 3 pay-per-view options. Do you remember what those 3 were?
I remember, obviously, this one because it won.
Yeah.
I think, did I give you Survivor Series 1998?
That was one of them, yes. Now, another one was a WCW pay-per-view, wasn't it, if I'm not mistaken?
Oh, yes.
Let's,
I believe it was Halloween Havoc 98.
You got it. So those were the 3 that we put up for listener choice on the Wrestling with Johners Facebook community page. And SummerSlam 92 won by a landslide. So obviously there's an appetite for WWF back in the day, and the weather's nice over here in the UK. Maybe it kind of sparked that thought of let's have a SummerSlam pay-per-view. Let's kind of revisit that magical moment. And of course, SummerSlam was held at Wembley Stadium 28 years ago. And as I've said many, many times on this podcast, I was actually there in attendance, 16-year-old Johners, enjoying it with my dad and a couple of friends. We got the coach down from Oxford to London, and what a magical day it was. And it was a beautiful day in London. I remember getting off the coach, walking up Wembley Way. There was all sorts of vendors selling merchandise and hot dogs and all sorts. So we had to buy a programme and a couple of T-shirts, of course, and then made it into the stadium. And we were kind of up in the gods. The ring looked tiny from where we were, but it was a magical, magical day. And I'd say it's remembered by many as being a bit of a 2-match card, you could say. The 2 main events, the Ultimate Warrior versus Randy Savage for the WWF World Championship at the time, and of course the Intercontinental Championship match that the show is most fondly remembered for, of course, Bret the Hitman Hart versus the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith. Now we'll get into those matches throughout this podcast, of course, but it was a magical time. Now, as I said, Rob, I was there, and I've seen it back many, many times when it first came out on VHS. I was there at W.H. Smith's waiting for them to open so I could get my copy of SummerSlam 92 28 years ago, and I've probably seen it back 100 times since then, especially with it being on the network and more recently, watching it back over the last couple of days on the network. But you've got a slightly different perspective on it because although you were an 80s and a 90s child, I'm guessing, you hadn't actually seen SummerSlam 92 until this week, in preparation for this episode. So give us a little bit of your thought process as to why you hadn't seen SummerSlam 92 before this week. Then I'm intrigued.
Once I got into wrestling, it was always that pay-per-view, and especially that main event of Davey Boy versus Bret. It was always one of those. It was always put on a pedestal as the match. It's the SummerSlam match. And I made the mistake of having a similar sort of feeling about WrestleMania 3, and obviously I watched that pay-per-view, and aside from the Steamboat versus Savage match, which stands up brilliantly to watching in the modern day, it's not a great pay-per-view at all, and it's sort of tarnished my opinion of certain pay-per-views, and I didn't want to go back and watch this, the big pay-per-view that everyone remembers from England, the one that everyone sort of goes back to and says, well, look at SummerSlam 1992, of course we should have pay-per-views in England. I just didn't want to go back and watch it and think, well, that was a bit crap. And just, be really, really disappointed. But, what better time than to do it with someone who is actually there, who was actually there, and to offer me who watched it I finished watching it this morning. So yeah.
Brilliant. But before we get headlong into SummerSlam 92, let's talk about your kind of exploits in podcast world and podcast land, because if I haven't already mentioned, you are from the Podmania Wrestling podcast, and you've got kind of a team of podcasters. I think there's you and two others, isn't there, Rob? And
There is, yeah.
Tell us a bit about Podmania and what you kind of bring to the masses, what you have to offer through your podcast then.
So when I first started, it was just after the Royal Rumble 2016 when I started the podcast. And it was me on my own, recording on my phone and then putting it on SoundCloud because I didn't know how to do podcasting. And then progressively it sort of built up. And then there's Garth Jackson, who joined me almost 3 years ago now. And then Chris, who joined, I think it was 2 years ago this month, actually. I think he was telling me it's his anniversary soon. And I started just doing WWE, and then I sort of fell out of love with WWE and started looking at other promotions. Got very, very heavily into New Japan, and I now have a New Japan podcast called the Young Lion Cast, which I do with Chris. And then I also got into Stardom as well, something completely different, which again I really, really enjoy, and I again do that on a monthly basis with Chris again. So those are the three main podcasts, of course, yourself as well. The Podmania podcast at the moment is centering on AEW. We do a weekly review of Dynamite, and yeah, basically just having a good time. And it's not too scripted, nothing like that. It's just three guys having a laugh, often over many drinks, and just basically, for lack of a better phrase, shooting the shit on wrestling.
Yeah, I love it. And of course, you probably would have heard Rob's voice, the opening kind of 15-second intro to every episode of Wrestling with Johners, because of course you are the voice of Podmania, Pro Wrestling Network, as you mentioned. But what kind of prompted you to start a network then? Of course, the Wrestling with Johners podcast is part of that network. You mentioned a couple of other podcasts, and what prompted you to start the network then, Rob?
In all honesty, I listen to a lot of podcasts on the Voices of Wrestling Network and things like that, and Post Wrestling. And I wanted to do something that's helped other podcasts and basically built up a collection, different perspectives on different things. I just wanted to bring that together, and if I could, help out other podcasts help, as well, if that was to be a thing. I wanted to basically have something to help other people, something to help other podcasts, and just have a wrestling community.
When you started, when you fired up the network last week or this morning, whenever you saw it, and put on the WWF Summerslam 92, you had that absolutely fantastic kind of opening video package to SummerSlam 92. It really captures the excitement of the fans waiting outside the Wembley Stadium, waiting to go in and see the show itself. I especially enjoyed all the fans. You saw a few video clips of some of the fans dressed up as their favourite wrestlers. You had a couple that were dressed up as the Bushwhackers and Macho Man and the Ultimate Warrior with all their face paints. So absolutely fantastic opening video. The bit that I really, really loved, and the bit that me and my friends used to kind of not necessarily take the mickey out of, but kind of copy the phrase over and over, was that when you've got the British Bulldog fan and he goes, the British Bulldog's going to win whether he wants to or not, and I absolutely cracked up with that. It's absolutely fantastic because of course the British Bulldog's going to win. He's going to want to win, of course, but it's iconic to those that were around at the time and loved the VHS version of SummerSlam. But here it is, the opening video package of SummerSlam 92. So a fantastic kind of, it really did capture the excitement of the British wrestling fans as well. And no doubt if we were to hold another big pay-per-view sometime in the future, if ever, then hopefully we'll have excited wrestling fans dressed up and kind of face painted and lots of cosplay of their favourite wrestlers in the 2000s. But Rob, can't wait to get stuck into this. I mean, the broadcast itself opens with Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan on commentary, and they introduced us to SummerSlam 92. The Brain was on top form as always during this broadcast. It took place on Saturday, August the 29th, 1992, as you said, Wembley Stadium, London, England. It aired in the States 2 days later on August the 31st, of course, and it was the first ever major WWF pay-per-view to take place outside of North America and Canada, of course. And currently they consider it to be the fourth largest audience ever to attend a WWF/WWE event with over 80,000 people. I think they got it recorded at 80,355. And nowadays that's kind of just edged out by WrestleMania 29 that had 80,676. WrestleMania 3, as you mentioned earlier, Rob, that had over 93,000 people according to the record books. And then of course WrestleMania 32, 32, wasn't it, a few years ago, that was reported to have had over 100,000 people in attendance. So I mean, I think if you listen to the Dave Meltzers of this world and the various dirt sheet writers, SummerSlam 92 was, officially the largest attended WWF pay-per-view of all time, even edging out WrestleMania 3. They were saying that 93,000 was heavily exaggerated. Have you heard similar stories at all about the attendance figure for SummerSlam? Because, it does vary from, writer to writer, I suppose.
It's a running joke, isn't it, about how the WWF inflate their numbers? It's every pay-per-view, and there was the running joke about WrestleMania 36. Were they going to inflate the numbers? Yeah. But here, I think it's widely said that it was over 80,000 fans. Whether it was a couple of hundred fans inflated, I think you are looking at 80,000 fans, definitely, more or less.
Yes.
Yeah, it certainly looked that way, and Wembley's rough capacity, because of course this is the old stadium. Yeah. Its rough capacity was, I think, roughly 80,000. I don't know that for sure, but I'm sure it was around that. So, and the stadium looked pretty full. I mean, you were there, you could probably tell me.
You couldn't see any spaces at all. And bearing in mind that it's usually around 80,000 just with the seats around the outside of the pitch, bearing in mind that you had tens of thousands on the pitch as well around ringside. So I'm pretty confident that it was well over 80,000 on that day. Yes.
Yeah, and the crowds, they really were the 12th man in this. They were on fire. I have never heard Virgil get such a reaction as he did. That just shows how rabid the British audience were for wrestling. Didn't matter what it was.
It doesn't matter what it was, though. Back in them days, we would have cheered absolutely anything from the WWF. But and that was the kind of the golden era of WWF as far as UK were concerned. I mean, I think WWF got popular when Sky started broadcasting it late 80s into the early 90s, and then of course they started doing their UK tours around 1991. Of course, you had that big Royal Albert Hall show where Davey Boy Smith won the Samovar Trophy from that Battle Royal main event, of course, and they obviously capitalised on the popularity of WWF, not just in the UK, but from across Europe, because you had fans that travelled from all over Europe to attend SummerSlam at Wembley, of course. But SummerSlam 92, it was originally intended to take place in Washington, D.C., but the WWF decided to move the event to Wembley Stadium due to the company's growing popularity in the UK and Europe, as I mentioned, and the possibility of increasing the revenue from that event. Shawn Michaels was originally booked to win the Intercontinental Championship from Bret Hart, had it have taken place in the States, but the storyline was adjusted due to the change of venue, and as a result, the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, was put into that Intercontinental Championship match against Bret Hart to main event the show. So quite interesting that, and I think there was some financial issues. I think that back in 92, the WWF were not doing brilliantly financially, so they decided to capitalise on that very, very, exciting and rabid and very, very popular fan base over in the UK. So it was something that definitely worked for them back in the day. But I mean, one of the questions that will come up towards the end of the show, Rob, will be about whether WWE should ever host another big pay-per-view over in the UK again. So we'll tackle that subject a bit later on, but very, very interesting as to why they decided to change their mind. And I think tickets only went on sale for SummerSlam 92 in June, bearing in mind that the pay-per-view took place in August. So it was kind of a bit of a last-minute change, but they, took advantage of having Sky on their side and did some fantastic marketing, got some wrestlers over. I remember the Ultimate Warrior and Hacksaw Jim Duggan being all over the TV screens over the summer promoting the show, and tickets sold out in, I think, less than 5 days. Now, WWF would have you believe that they sold out within 6 hours or certainly day one, but within the first 5 days, they'd certainly sold well over 65,000 seats, and then in the subsequent weeks, they managed to sell out all the other tickets. So very, very interesting as far as that was concerned. But let's have a look at the show itself then, Rob. So a few matches that doesn't show on the WWE Network, and I don't think they actually aired in the original pay-per-view. There was a couple of dark matches, and that was Tito Santana versus Papa Shango, the Bushwhackers, Jim Duggan and versus the Nasty Boys and the Mountie. And one match that took place quite late on in the card was Tatanka versus the Berserker, but none of them three matches actually featured on the pay-per-view or the WWE Network presentation. So was you aware of them dark matches that I just mentioned?
I was aware of the Tatanka one. Obviously, that was actually the semi-main if you look at the running order of the pay-per-view.
Indeed.
Which is, exactly what you need after the Undertaker versus Kamala. But I did think it was strange that the Bushwhackers and the Nasty Boys delivered promos during the show, but weren't actually there. It seemed a complete waste of time to fly them over from, Stamford, Connecticut to England just to do a promo. But this, of course, makes far more sense. I don't know how much we'd have missed in a match between the Bushwhackers and the Nasty Boys.
Not an awful lot, to be fair.
I can imagine. Not exactly known for their in-ring potential, are they, the Nasty Boys and the Bushwhackers?
Yeah, but another interesting thing, I mean, one of the matches that was on the pre-show, one of the dark matches that didn't air, Tito Santana versus Papa Shango. Now, the plans were originally that Papa Shango was going to be going up against Kerry Von Erich, the Texas Tornadoes. So prior to and in the build-up to SummerSlam, Kerry Von Erich, the Texas Tornado, actually filmed some promos that were aired to hype up the match against Papa Shango. But then, of course, I think Kerry Von Erich was fired partway through the build, I think maybe July, so not quite into August. Then plans were changed and they inserted Tito Santana. And so the rest is history. And of course, Kerry Von Erich left the company. And obviously, we know that his life went on a bit of a downward spiral from there. But very interesting that it could have been Kerry Von Erich instead of Tito Santana. And that would have been a fun match, I'm sure. But let's go straight into the kind of the main card. And the opening match on the main card was the Legion of Doom versus Money Incorporated, Money Inc. And now I spoke about this briefly during our kind of WrestleMania 8 retro review, I believe it was, with Chris and Nick from Broken But Glorious Wrestling Podcast about Rocco, the ventriloquist dummy of LOD that came down to the ring with Hawk and Animal, as well as longtime manager Paul Ellering. He was strapped to the front of one of them Harley Davidsons. And I don't know if you was aware of this, Rob, but Hawk left the company. I think this was his last WWF match at the time. Left the company because he was so much against the Rocco, the mascot gimmick. Like I say, immediately left after SummerSlam 92, and neither Animal or Hawk were seen back in the WWF for 4.5, nearly 5 years, 1997. So, I mean, I thought that taking a very kind of tough team like LOD, the Road Warriors, ass kickers, and then just giving them a mascot in the shape of a ventriloquist dummy really wasn't doing anything for their street cred, to be honest with you. It might have been fine for the kids and for merchandise sales, but when you saw Rocco, and then of course Paul Ellering was doing the very poor ventriloquist act at ringside during the match, what were your thoughts on that? You must have thought, well, this isn't the LOD that I remember watching from all them years ago.
It's one of those head-scratchingly baffling moments where you realise that a tag team that clearly Vince adored because he created a Poundland version of them in Demolition and gave them the tag titles for goodness knows how long.
Yeah.
So he obviously knew who they were, he knew what they were about, but to then, repackaging them for the Road Warriors to Legion of Doom, absolutely fine, didn't do their street cred any harm whatsoever, and in the ring they were still utter badasses. You then put them with a ventriloquist dummy. Now, that ventriloquist dummy can be the coolest looking dummy in the world. You can put as much leather and as cooler sunglasses as you want on a ventriloquist dummy. but you are not. It does not go with that gimmick at all. You've got the Legion of Doom. You heard the eruption of noise as they came down to the ring on
it was a Road Warrior pop. It was a Road Warrior, exactly. Yeah.
Which I'm not entirely sure that Hawk should have been driving a motorcycle if rumours are to be believed about how high he was during this pay-per-view. But yeah, Rocco it's an absolute menace on the Legion of Doom. And to be perfectly honest, if I was either Animal or Hawk, I think I'd have stormed out after this pay-per-view having to strap that dummy around.
Yeah, but it makes you wonder, had they not have had that dummy as their mascot, they would have been happy to have stayed with the company for months, if not years, into the future, and what a great career they would have had in the WWF, because they only joined the company the year prior, in 1991, and we remember them winning the WWF Tag Team titles against Demolition at WrestleMania 7, if I'm not mistaken. So a bit of a... I'm sure that was a bit of an annoyance for Vince McMahon that they left. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, Animal revealed years later that Hawk had taken drugs before flying over to the UK for SummerSlam, and was, Hawk himself was anticipating a failure. Animal didn't know about this at the time, certainly not going into the match, but it was more than aware of his partner's troubles and keeping clean, and he's got a bit of a history of drug abuse, of course. And recalls that Vince McMahon wasn't happy with Hawk's, obvious lethargy, and during the match, I think the Animal kind of had to control a lot of the match, and Hawk was, I think he nearly fell off the top turnbuckle at one point, but I think Animal really kind of kept the tight reins on what Hawk was doing during that match. But they did manage to capture the win. They did beat IRS and Ted DiBiase, and I think Animal won following a scoop slam, of course. But it's also reported that, Hawk allegedly skipped out on the flight back to the US and began hanging around with some London Hells Angels, a biker gang, of course. And at the TV tapings days later, Animal was told that Hawk had quit the promotion, and it was the last time that the team would actually be together, SummerSlam 92, until they reunited in WCW about 4 years later in early 1996. So, I mean... we mentioned about Rocco, that's all history, but up until that point, any thoughts on LOD's kind of WWF kind of run? And like I say, he started off quite well with that championship win at WrestleMania 7, and I know that Hawk was suspended in the early part of 1992, which meant that they didn't feature at WrestleMania 8, of course, and then this was kind of their big triumphant kind of return, for want of a better word. But any thoughts looking back on their early run with the WWF?
First things first, if they did Rocco as a marketing stunt, who is buying that dummy? It was the creepiest looking thing. I mean, you wouldn't want to buy one. Yeah. I think overall, Hawk's, demons, his addictions, I think it did stunt, especially that first run. They were billed as such an amazing tag team. They were, you saw wrestling magazines, you saw the red football pads, the spikes, and they were so iconic. And then they came to the WWF, and yes, they won the tag titles. Yes, they won them at WrestleMania. Yes, they moment. But apart from that, it was almost anticlimactic. And I think because Vince had already done the demolition thing, we'd already got used to seeing that sort of tag team, that sort of face-painted tag team. And sure, LOD were hugely over. Again, the LOD pop. And as soon as you hear that, what a rush, it just erupts. So they're clearly over. But it's the little things, like the Legion of Doom / the Road Warriors, however you want to refer to them. They are over, as in the Doomsday Device is over. That move is, to my mind, the greatest tag team finisher. They didn't do it here, which just, it baffled me. I mean, I don't know whether this was originally planned, and you mentioned earlier that Hawk looked pretty unsteady on the top rope, and that might have led into the finish, changed the finish. But I find it very, very strange that you have got LOD opening SummerSlam in front of 80,000 absolutely rabid British fans, and they don't do the thing that, let's be perfectly honest, the Legion of Doom are mostly known for.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, it's also reported that, an Animal remembers seeing Hawk openly popping sedatives in front of many of the locker room peers before coming to the ring. As I mentioned, he could barely wrestle that night at Wembley Stadium, let alone ride a bike to the ring, as you mentioned, for the entrance. So it's incredible that match kind of went as smoothly as it did, and it's widely considered to be one of the better matches on the card outside of the two main events. But
By
there we go.
quite a distance as well.
Yeah,
By
absolutely,
quite a
absolutely.
distance.
Then we get a backstage promo from Ric Flair. He's with Mean Gene Okerlund, of course, and Mean Gene is demanded to know who Mr. Perfect, whose corner Mr. Perfect will be in. During the WWF Championship match between Savage and the Ultimate Warrior, which we'll get into a bit later, and that's another masterpiece from not only Ric Flair but also Mean Gene. He never did a bad backstage segment as far as I was concerned. A really fun promo from these two, with Ric Flair giving nothing away about which corner Mr. Perfect will be in. And then we go into a match that is not very fondly remembered: Nails versus Virgil. Two individuals I don't think I've ever mentioned before on my podcast, and we're 125 episodes in, but we see Nails easily defeat Virgil, Soul Train Jones, but Virgil back in those days in less than 4 minutes with a bit of a choke hold sleeper. But Nails' WWF career was short-lived, as no more than 3 months later, during the December the 14th Superstars tapings, Nails cornered Vince McMahon in his office and is alleged to have screamed at him over his SummerSlam payoff, feeling that it was too low. Bret Hart recalls hearing a loud crash from the office, apparently caused by Nails knocking McMahon off of his chair before putting McMahon himself into the very same chokehold that he had Virgil in during the SummerSlam event. So a host of officials quickly broke up the altercations, and Nails was immediately fired by McMahon. Shortly after, Nails apparently called the police and claimed that Vince McMahon had made a sexual pass at him to explain why he assaulted his now former boss. But this, of course, was all a bit of a smokescreen, in many people's opinion, for what he had done to the boss over his SummerSlam payoff. So, any thoughts on the match first of all, and then any thoughts on kind of Nails as a character? I mean, he was brought in as a bit of a feud for the Big Boss Man. He was meant to have been one of Boss Man's prisoners in Cobb County, Georgia, but an interesting character. They did eventually have Nails versus Boss Man in the big kind of blow-off match to their feud in a nightstick on a pole match at Survivor Series before the end of the year. And of course, Nails was gone by December the 14th. So any thoughts on this one?
This was a terrible match. Let's make no bones about it. Virgil was never great in the ring. Even with his feud with Ted DiBiase, he had punches, and that's it. Here, Nails had one move, and that was the double-handed "I'm going to strangle you" move. In the ring, Virgil, if you're trying to get Nails over, or try and accent Nails' very, very few positives, you need someone good in the ring, and unfortunately, Virgil was not that person. It went 3 minutes 55, and it felt a good 10 minutes longer than that. It was it was not a good match at all. The only thing I remember really, apart from, like I say, Nails having one move and it was sort of stumbling Frankenstein-like towards his opponent, it was that Vince was talking about how it wasn't a sleeper hold, it was a choke hold, and him and the Brain sort of having that debate whether it was a sleeper or a choke. That was the most interesting part of the match, which speaks volumes about how interested I actually was in the in-ring action.
Yeah, exactly. But largely forgettable. But like I say, the story that followed it regarding Nails and Vince McMahon's altercation at the Superstars taping in December is definitely one of folklore. But very, very interesting there. But and then we go into a match that I was really looking forward to going into SummerSlam, especially as a kid, looking forward to this. Big fan of Shawn Michaels growing up. I enjoyed Rick the Model Martel, and they were going up against one another at SummerSlam '92. Shawn Michaels, of course, came down with Sherry Martel. Now, as I said, to go into this one, I was already starting to appreciate the kind of the finer side of wrestling, and kind of aside from the silly gimmicks and the silly characters, I was kind of more interested in kind of more the scientific side of wrestling, and enjoying a good back and forth match. And that's what I thought I was going to get here between these two. But of course, there was a predetermined stipulation set out by Sherry that neither man, being as pretty as they were, could touch one another's face or hit one another's face. So that was the kind of the predetermined stipulation going into it. But like I say, I thought that both of these two very accomplished wrestlers could put on a really good mat classic, but we didn't get that here, to be honest with you. It turned into a bit of a farce, a bit of a comedy match, was a bit of a letdown for me, knowing that these two are far more capable than what they actually delivered that Saturday night in Wembley. But both wrestlers broke the pre-match stipulation by slapping each other across the face, and with the match ending in a double count-out, with both men taking turns in trying to carry the unconscious Sherry back to the locker room as well, until Martel dumps a bucket of water over Sherry's head, much to the delight of 80,000 fans in London that night. So any thoughts on this one? Did you enjoy the match? Did it deliver in any way, in your opinion? Did you kind of get into the gimmick of it all? But what are your thoughts on Shawn Michaels versus Rick Martel?
First of all, I think the biggest question is, did you cheer? Were you one of the people that cheered when she got the bucket of water dunked on her?
Of course I did. Of course I did.
With the stipulation that you weren't allowed to hit each other in the face, it did sort of hamstring them a little bit. I'm with you 100%. I thought this match, you see Shawn Michaels, who of course is one of the all-time greats and will go on to be world champion, and not until 1996, I think he got his first championship. He'd go on to be Intercontinental Champion, all this sort of thing. Rick the Model Martel, I think, was quite an underrated performer. He was brilliantly sound in the ring. He was, one of those people, along with people like Tito Santana, who was great in the ring, but never really got above the mid-card. And it's a shame, because his gimmick was fantastic. I really enjoyed his gimmick of the model, the arrogant model with, the arrogance. And I thought this match could be fantastic. And unfortunately, it became very quickly very apparent that it wasn't about the in-ring sort of clout of these two men. It was more about the comedy stylings of Sherry. It was very much about, oh, look what Sherry is not wearing, because that was mentioned about 50 times by Vince, and by Bobby Heenan had an absolute belter the entire show. I thought he was absolutely fantastic on commentary. I giggled the entire way through this match, just at the little ridiculous references he was making. But yeah, the angle sort of ruined what could have been a very, very, very competent match. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think Michaels and Martel did a good job up until, the farce on the outside. But yeah, it put a dampener on what could have been a good match.
Yeah, definitely. But moving on, then we had a match for the WWF Tag Team titles. It was Bo and Blake, the Beverley brothers, accompanied to the ring by the Genius, of course, going up against Earthquake and Typhoon, the Natural Disasters. Now, going back to one of my earlier matches on the card, Monique versus Legion of Doom, that was originally going to be the WWF Tag title match, believe it or not, but the Natural Disasters, they defeated Monique on a house show in July. It's just the month prior, and it was speculated that the WWF management knew that LOD was on their way out of the company, so switched the titles on this house show, putting the belts on the Natural Disasters, thus changing the tag title match to this one instead, with the Beverley brothers being in contention. But this was a fun match. It went 10 minutes. I thought it was pretty good for what it was, with the Beverley brothers having the large portion of the offense, thanks largely to their heel tactics. But once the Typhoon, or formerly known as Tugboat and future Shopmaster, of course, once he got the hot tag to Earthquake, the pinfall was forthcoming, thanks to the Earthquake splash, of course. Now, back in the day, I thought the Beverley brothers were pretty good. I was disappointed thinking back that they didn't actually get a run as WWF Tag Team Champions, to be honest with you. They were hard hitting. They were, they had a good cohesive look as a tag team. They had the manager. They were awesome heels. They had a pretty good finisher as well. I think there's a bit of a gif or a meme going around on Facebook at the moment of the Beverley brothers kind of dropping some jobber on their head through their finisher. It was a pretty devastating finisher. I think they usually kind of completed the finisher a lot more tidily than they did in that gift that's going around. But to great heels, a great manager, had a great look, were really, really accomplished wrestlers, and they never got a run with the tag. I thought this was a good opportunity possibly to switch the titles, but WWF keeping it very babyface friendly during this show, certainly in this match anyway. But any thoughts on this one, the Beverley Brothers versus the Natural Disasters, with the titles on the line, of course?
I was always an enormous fan of Earthquake and John Tenter, and he's one of those people that I always look back on and think he could have been much more. He was the perfect heel foil for Hogan in the early 90s when he debuted and they had that match, which admittedly wasn't great at SummerSlam 90. He was the perfect foil, and I think he could have been a champion and someone that Hogan then fought to get the championship. I never rated Tugboat, Typhoon, Shotmaster. I never rated him in the ring, and here it was very, very slow. I mean, the Beverley Brothers, they tried, bless them. They tried to get a lot of heat on Typhoon, obviously building up to that hot tag for Earthquake.
Yes.
For what it was fine. I think it went 10 minutes 30, and bearing in mind this was longer than Shawn and Rick just. I feel it went a little bit too long, especially as, a lot of Typhoon and Earthquake's offense, and Typhoon especially, is literally running into someone. And, that's great, but, you've got to have a little bit more if you're going to go 10 minutes. I completely agree with you. I think the Beverley Brothers were a bit of a wasted talent. I think they could have had quite easily, when you look at tag teams through history that have actually held those championships, and then you look at the Beverley Brothers, who seem to have everything that Vince McMahon loves in a tag team. They were tall, they were muscular, they were blonde, they were good-looking guys, and Vince seems to love that in his athletes. So it seems very strange that they didn't switch the tag belts here. I don't think, the Natural Disasters were originally formed as heel stables. As a heel tag team. And they lent themselves so much better to being a heel tag team. And I don't know whether it's because of their size or because of their moveset or just because John Tenter was great as a heel. I don't think the dynamic worked here. I don't like the Natural Disasters as faces. But yeah, overall it was a completely inoffensive match. It didn't do anything to particularly offend me. I like the Beverley Brothers. I liked Earthquake. It just went a little bit long for me.
Yeah, but certainly not as bad as Virgil versus Nails, put it that way. So something to celebrate, I suppose. But no,
is that how we're comparing all the matches now? Comparing them to Virgil versus Nails.
Absolutely, yes. You've got to take it from zero to what we get at the end. But like I say, I'm disappointed looking back. Before they joined the WWF, the Beverley Brothers were the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, I believe they were, and they had a great run. I think in AWA. I don't think they featured in WCW, but we're a fantastic tag team, and I think that their gimmick was probably a little bit too soft, to be honest with you. They probably should have come in as, I don't know, maybe a bit more of a hard ass team. I don't know, more of an ass kicker, but with what they had and the genius being their manager, I thought that they could have done a lot more with that tag team. And yes, they had opportunities. They were in tag title matches like this one here, for example at SummerSlam in Wembley, and I'm sure they had many other prominent matches. I think they did have a run with the Steiners as well, and a great feud they had with those, but were never quite given, the Duke, should we say, the win, the big win, or kind of, they never really overcame in any of their feuds. So more could have been done with a talented team like that, looking back on it. But and I agree with you regarding the Natural Disasters. I think they were much more effective. They really were. I think that they should have remained heels, to be honest with you. You don't have two big guys like that and dress them up as baby faces. But I don't think Vince McMahon really quite knew what to do with that team, if I'm honest with you. But speaking of former tag team partners, we had Crush versus the Repo Man. Now, they didn't really position this as a former kind of tag team partner going up against one another. But you, of course, had Crush versus Repo Man, and they were, of course, former Demolition members. Now, you mentioned about Demolition earlier, Rob. Any thoughts on these two individuals? I mean, I personally was a big fan of Crush. I liked him as part of the Demolition stable, but I thought as a babyface, I thought, yeah, he's got the look, he's got the size, he's pretty agile for a big guy, he's got some pretty good moves. And I thought that they were possibly setting up him up as the next big babyface, the next big Hogan, dare I say it. But any thoughts on these two before we get into the match?
It seemed for a long time that Crush was going to be positioned as the next big thing. You know, lots of little story beats that sort of they put him in the ring with Macho Man at WrestleMania 10, which is it's a prevalent place to be. Yes, it wasn't for the title, but it's against Macho Man at Mania. It never seemed to materialize. I know that he had his own demons with steroids and things like that, and he was ultimately let go from the company because of that. And I think that probably stunted it in the same way we were talking about Hawk earlier. As for the fact that this was actually Barry Darso's own idea to package himself as the Repo Man is just it baffles me. I don't understand what he thought the ceiling was going to be on that gimmick. I don't know whether he thought he'd come in with his little, his amazing laugh. Let's not joke. His laugh is fantastic. But coming in as this person who literally repossesses people's property. What did he think was going to be the ceiling of this gimmick? Did he think he was going to be a champion with this gimmick? Ridiculous. You're absolutely right, though. They never really acknowledge the fact that these two have been in Demolition, which is a shame, especially as they are one of the most instantly recognizable tag teams in the WWF, and obviously have just come off the back of that mammoth title run that we were talking about earlier. There's not a lot to talk about in this match either, John.
No, it's very, very short. I think it only went 3 or 4 minutes once again. I mean, going back to when this originally aired, the UK airing of SummerSlam 92 did not show this match, believe it or not. They did air it on the US broadcast, the US pay-per-view, and of course it's here on the network, and it was on the VHS version, but it didn't air on the UK version for whatever reason, not sure why. Now, as mentioned, I was a big fan of Crush. I thought he could potentially have been the next big thing, the next Hulk Hogan. He had the look, he had the agility. I liked his costume, loved his music. His entrance music was kick-ass. And the Cranium Crusher as his finisher. But I think that's how it ended. And I mean, if you'd heard my WrestleMania 9 retro pay-per-view review with Mike Mad Dog Angus from a few weeks back, we mentioned Crush and his match against Doink. And we saw the beginnings of Double Doink there. But here in August 92, I honestly thought that they had something special in the Crush, but in the Kona Crush, shall we say, but that never quite materialised. But it was fun for what it was, 3 or 4 minutes. And Crush, of course, overcame in that one. But I mean, I'm kind of slightly the reverse of yourself. I enjoyed the Repo Man gimmick. I thought it was a pretty good gimmick. He played it very well. He was invested in the gimmick, much like Matt Bourne, who played Doink, the original evil clown. I thought Barry Darso really invested in the Repo Man gimmick, and like I say, well, yeah, there is a certain ceiling that you can only go to when you're dressed in a raccoon mask with tire treads printed on your trunks, of course, on your tights. But character-wise, yeah, I don't think he was ever going to be world champion, was he? But I thought it was a good, memorable gimmick, and to the point where he still gets brought up in many podcasts nowadays, and so he had 2 good gimmicks, you could say. Was he Axe or Smash of Crush? I can't remember.
I believe. Sorry, I that exact reason, because I knew I would have to look at that later. He was Smash.
Yeah,
he was Smash.
He pulled off 2 good gimmicks there in Repo Man and Smash of Demolition, but there we go. And then one of the big talking points of the whole show, and this was kind of more than halfway into the show, but Macho Man, Randy Savage, current WWF World Heavyweight Champion, going into the match, going up against the Ultimate Warrior. And believe it or not, this was actually aired as the main event in the US pay-per-view broadcast of the show 2 nights later, of course. But they're being live and now watching it on the network. They've got it all in the correct order. It was several matches from the top. So what do we have? The Undertaker match. And of course, we had Tatanka versus Berserker. But this was one half of the double main event, Rob. Now, the Macho Man Randy Savage, the Ultimate Warrior, here for the WWF Championship, as I said, and it was more than a good enough sequel to their epic match that they had at WrestleMania 7. I think when you look at Ultimate Warrior's all-time great matches, of course, his WrestleMania 6 encounter with Hulk Hogan is always remembered as being, quite a good match, considering the participants. And then of course, you had Randy Savage versus the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 7, and then this one is fondly remembered being a very good sequel to that WrestleMania match just over 12 months later. But this was a pretty good match. I think it was the longest match on the card, went about 28 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the storyline going into this was Mr. Perfect, who was aligned with Ric Flair, of course, was claiming that he was going to be managing or maybe in the corner of one of the two men, but wouldn't let on or wouldn't say which wrestler he would be in the corner of. And this bred paranoia between Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior, of course, and the idea that the other one was on the take, and that they knew that Mr. Perfect was going to be in their corner. But WWE, WWF at the time was planning on turning the Ultimate Warrior at around this time, with Mr. Perfect's involvement, steering the face-painted Warrior in that direction. However, the Ultimate Warrior turned the idea down flat and remained the babyface until his firing later on that year in November. So, this was a classic babyface versus babyface match that went 28 minutes. And I remember, what I remember about this match was the intensity, the drama of the match between these two wrestlers, the crowd noise, which was immense. Now, of course, the match ended, if I'm not mistaken, in a count out. I think Randy Savage got counted out but retained the championship. Any thoughts on this one? This one is widely considered to be the second best match on the card, and we'll obviously be talking about the best match on the card very, very soon. But for what it was good. You had the drama on the outside with Ric Flair, Mr. Perfect, and then, of course, a very good match between Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior. But what was your thoughts on this one when you were watching it back down this week then, Rob?
It was such simplistic storytelling, and they executed it perfectly. There's always a bit of a problem with babyface versus babyface title matches, because you don't necessarily want one to be more over than the other. You've got Randy Savage, who's an incredible worker and is the figurehead of the company. You've got Warrior, who is, a fantastic presence and a figurehead of the company. You don't necessarily want people to be booing Warrior and cheering Savage. Now, how do you get around that? You book the simplest of stories and put Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect in it. And it was absolutely fantastic. It worked beautifully. Now, I hate interference in matches unless it's subtle and it plays into a storyline later on. Then I just hate it. I think people should be able to do more in a wrestling match without. I feel like it's a little bit of a coward's way out. However, here I just thought everything worked so well. I think Macho Man had a wonderful way of getting the best out of the Ultimate Warrior, who, let's face it, isn't the most apt in the ring. He was not booked to be apt in the ring. He never promised to be anything close in the ring. But here he was doing vertical suplexes. He was doing sidewalk slams. He was catching Savage when Savage was coming off the top rope. And Savage made him look really, really good. And give Ultimate Warrior his due, he sold the part perfectly. Who knew that something so simple as to go, Mr. Perfect's going to come out, but he's not telling you whose corner he's in. Something as simple as that. It was brilliant. Those mind games we played. Flair played his part absolutely superbly. I don't know how I feel about Ultimate Warrior's meat tights.
That was strange. That was very strange. Yeah.
Yeah. When you compare that to his, he was still brightly coloured. He still got the brightly coloured tassels. He was still doing the running. I mean, he fell up the stairs, which you saw on the network version, which was really funny. And he still had the same he was still the same character. I don't really understand the meat tights. But yeah, overall, this was far better than I thought it was going to be. I think it's not quite as good as their Mania 7 match. I mean, their Mania 7 match is a retirement match. There's more inherent drama there. But here, I thought they did fantastic with what they had. I thought Ultimate Warrior, who, again, I've just said, you listen to shoot interviews, people will slag off his work rate till the cows come home. Here, he was made to look great. In a 28-minute match, the Ultimate Warrior was made to look very, very, very good. And I think Meltzer gave this 4 stars, which, the Ultimate Warrior in a Meltzer 4-star rated match it just wouldn't think it would happen. But yeah, the drama was great, the storytelling was great, and both men, really, really good. Did you say that this aired as the main event in America?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
So,
I think they switched the 2 matches around. Either they had Bulldog versus Bret Hart as the semi-main and this going on last, but when this aired in the States, they edited it so that this was the very last match on the show.
I don't understand how that would work, because when Ultimate Warrior came out, yes, it was getting dark, but it was still quite obviously light, whereas it was pitch black during Davey Boy versus Bret. So I'm not entirely sure how that would work, but saying that, they did cut out half the matches for the broadcasts anyway. So
they did. I mean, my main disappointment going into this was that Ric Flair wasn't involved in a match. I was the biggest Ric Flair fan kind of growing up, certainly around this time. A big fan of his, when you look at what he accomplished in 1992, winning the Rumble, being one half of the main event against Savage at WrestleMania 8, and that was a fantastic match. I was really, really hoping that they would involve or include Ric Flair in a match for SummerSlam, so I could see him with my own 2 eyes in the flesh, actually wrestling in the ring. But his involvement on the outside was fine, and big fan of his and Mr. Perfect's partnership at the time. Really, really loved that combo. I thought that they kind of really interacted and that added to the match, you could say. But it was a good match, good drama, bit of a flat ending, to be honest with you. If this did go on last in the States when they aired the pay-per-view 2 nights later, having a count out ending conclusion to this world title match as the main event must have felt a bit flat kind of watching it in the US, but there we go. And then we had what is kind of the semi-main event match, you could say, The Undertaker versus Kamala. Now, The Undertaker, of course, came down to the ring on the back of a hearse. That was pretty special. I thought the entrance of The Undertaker was pretty special. Kamala came down with Harvey Whippleman and Kim Chi. But now, this was the era when The Undertaker would take on any and all monster heels, and whether they was 8 foot tall or 300, 400 pounds, and of course, during our WrestleMania 9 retro review with Mike Mad Dog Angus, we covered Taker's match against Giant Gonzalez. And this match was along the same lines, to be honest with you. It wasn't a great match. It was, for me, about the entrances and about the crowd involvement. The crowd were really into this. We saw The Undertaker do his legendary rope walk, but just as he was about to pick Kamala up for the tombstone, I think Kim Chi came into the ring. The referee called for the bell, disqualification. Kamala did a couple of splashes. I think he did one from the canvas, one from the second rope, and he even did a splash off the top rope, which was when I watched it back a couple of days ago, I thought, well, that's amazing for a 300+ pound man. And Kamala wasn't known for his agility, to be honest with you, but that was quite impressive. And then, of course, the Undertaker just sat up. The Kamala and co, they ran off in fear as the Undertaker chased them back down the aisle back to the locker rooms. But it was another short match. I think it went 3 or 4 minutes. Again, it seemed to last longer, like another match that you mentioned earlier. It seemed to last 10 minutes longer than it actually was, but it was fun for what it was. The fans at the time, they ate it up. They absolutely loved it, and being there, seeing the Undertaker's entrance as it was getting dark, coming out on the hearse, hearing that gong go off. And then, I thought it was fine as a spectacle. But when you were watching it back this week, Rob, what did you think?
Couple of things. The first thing I thought was, my God, who was the Undertaker pissed off between 92 and 95? Because a list of his opponents. So if we start from 1992 and work our way through to WrestleMania 11, the people that he fought were Kamala, Giant Gonzalez at WrestleMania 9. He also had a feud with Mr. Hughes in between that. I don't know if you remember Mr. Hughes.
I do indeed.
He then went on to fight Yokozuna. And then got into a feud with himself at SummerSlam 1994.
Oh dear.
And then went on to fight King Kong Bundy. So I don't know who he'd pissed off, who he'd annoyed, but my God, that run of opponents. When you're looking at that run of opponents and go, Yokozuna's the best opponent there, that's not great.
I wonder how many times Undertaker considered going to WCW back then, because he probably would have thought, oh, I'm going to get a better opponent if I went south. But no, he stuck at it, and we're glad that he did. And of course, his matches got a lot better, and certainly as you get into the 2000s and the latter 2000s. But please carry on with your review of the match.
Well, Bruce Pritchard on his podcast always says that whenever Undertaker went into the office and they go, oh, I'm not sure about that, Taker, he'd just bring up Giant Gonzalez, and the people doing the booking would go, oh, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, we did make you get in the ring with Giant Gonzalez. As for the match, I imagine that is why it went on so late, so that Taker's entrance was during the evening or during dusk. Undertaker's entrance was fantastic here. It was the best part of this. The only blessing is that it was short. The moment where Taker sits up at the end after the Kamala beatdown, which I didn't think I'd ever say, Kamala beating down the Undertaker. The moment that he sits up and the entire crowd erupts are just absolutely magical. I mean, when he's getting into the ring to start the match, you can hear the crowd singing along with his theme. And Taker is relatively early on in his WWF run here. You know, he debuted Survivor Series 1990, so he was less than 2 years into his run, and people are still singing or, chanting his theme as he's entering the ring. The man was iconic less than 2 years into his run, and how do you treat him? You put him in the ring with a man who's most famous for slapping his belly during the Diva Search. So, yeah, not a lot to talk about here, John, unfortunately. Terrible match. Only blessing is that it went less than 4 minutes.
Agreed. Well, let's talk about what's widely considered to be one of the best matches in WWF, WWE history, and one of the greatest SummerSlam matches of all time. It was, of course, the main event, the match that went on last if you were there in the flesh, or if you've watched it back on the network. It obviously didn't go on last if you caught the US pay-per-view airing 2 nights later, but it was, of course, Bret the Hitman Hart versus the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith for the WWF Intercontinental Championship. And, had SummerSlam taken place in Washington over in the US, then Bret Hart would likely have dropped the IC title to Shawn Michaels in a ladder match, believe it or not. The ladder match that Hart and Michaels ended up having in July 1992. That was a bit of a dress rehearsal for what was meant to have been a rematch of sorts, or the first ever official WWF ladder match at SummerSlam 92. That was supposed to demonstrate to McMahon what a ladder match was, what it looked like, and that it could work on a pay-per-view. And of course, I think the first proper ladder match we saw was at WrestleMania 10, so a year and a half later. As it was, what we got was a masterclass in, two very, very accomplished wrestlers. And one of the most memorable moments of the match for me followed the double knockout spot towards the end of the match, and both men were lying prone on the canvas. Hart somehow managed to maneuver his leg up and over his brother-in-law's legs, wrapping Bulldog's legs around his before flipping him over and standing up for the sharpshooter, firmly applying his finishing move, of course. And Hart claims that he came up with that spot while laying in bed at 3 a.m. one morning, and had actually woken up his then wife Julie to try it out at 3 a.m. in the morning on the bedroom floor, so that he could kind of do a bit of a dress rehearsal for what he was going to do to the Davey Boy Smith at SummerSlam. And the fact that Bret managed to talk his groggy wife into getting out of bed, lying on the floor, and participating in that impromptu testing of the sharpshooter, definitely shows a lot towards the patience that she had, and the love she had for Bret at the time. But as it turned out, Hart had to do most of the heavy lifting, as we know, during this match. Bret Hart claims in his book that he he tried to reach out to his brother-in-law, Davey Boy Smith, to map out the biggest match of each man's life at the time, but Smith would not return his calls. The Hitman didn't cross paths with Davey Boy Smith until the night before the pay-per-view, and it was there that Smith admitted that he'd spent the weeks leading up to the match smoking crack cocaine with his fellow Hart-in-law, Jim Neidhart. So Davey Boy Smith was not in any fit shape to be going into such a big match. Yes, Hart sat down with the Bulldog, crafted out the match there and then the night before the show. But shortly after the bell rang on that Saturday night, the Bulldog admitted that he'd forgotten the entire plan. So Hart had to call every single spot the rest of the way through the match, essentially babysitting Davey Boy Smith through what ended up being a true masterpiece, with the Bulldog getting the pinfall after 25 minutes, 40 seconds, after reversing a sunset flip into a pinning combination to become the new Intercontinental Champion. And it's that clip that's played over and over again with Bret Hart and Diana Smith and Davey Boy with the Intercontinental Championship and the fireworks going off, and that's how SummerSlam went off the air. But it was a tremendous match, and being there, in Wembley Stadium, it was just the whole match was electric, and it gripped you. It absolutely gripped you, and even from where my vantage point, you could see everything that was going on. Everybody was hooked, it was so gripping, so thrilling, and the ending was perfect. But what a match! And I think Dave Meltzer gave it 4.5 stars. I would easily give it 5 stars, having been there in the flesh and watched it myself. But what I also liked is the psychology. I love the psychology in this match, with both wrestlers going into the match as clear baby faces, but with Hart portraying the heel when the match was at its peak to get even more sympathy on the hometown boy. So, Rob, you saw this match for the first time this week. You kind of shied away from watching SummerSlam 92 because you didn't want to be disappointed with everybody's hype about the show and the match that finished it in particular. But having watched it back this week, did it live up to the hype? And did it kind of, how did you feel once you saw it? Did you feel let down in any way, or did it live up to the expectations?
Possibly the highest praise I can give this match. As I was watching it, I thought, well, I wonder how I would feel about this match in an empty arena setting. How we're watching wrestling today.
Yeah. And
as I was watching it, and I thought, even without the crowd, this match would still be great.
Yes.
This match, if I was throwing out Meltzer stars, without a crowd, this match would still be 4 stars.
Yes.
The crowd made this 5 stars. This match is damn near perfect. Made even more so by the fact that Bulldog hadn't got a single clue what he was doing. He was gassed for most of this match, and you can see there's a horrible spot where I don't know whether he's trying to slam Bret or trying to give him some sort of Samoan drop, but he ends up just dropping Bret into the ropes and sort of leans against it, trying to catch his breath. It's a terrifying moment. It could have really been a lot more serious for Bret. But even that aside, this match was, I agree with you completely, it was 5 stars. I mean, even going back to just before the match, those 2 promos that Davey Boy and Bret gave. The Davey Boy one, Davey Boy has never been great on the microphone, never ever. Yet here it was a good promo. It wasn't fantastic. He stuttered over a few words, but nevertheless still a good promo. Bret, who again, my only criticism really of Bret is that he had a lack of personality. He was a personality vacuum. Here, I've never been more invested in Bret. I've never felt like Bret has meant something as much as he did during this interview. It was brilliant. I would argue that's one of the best promos Bret Hart has ever cut. The match itself, like I say, Bret is a technical genius. That spot that you mentioned where he manages to loop his legs around and stand up with Davey Boy in the sharpshooter is just fantastic. The match never dropped pace. In 25 minutes, with a gassed Bulldog, this match still went at the right pace. I thought it was good how the stuff with Diana Smith, I thought was great. It didn't take over the match as much as, things like this would later on in the WWF with, the feud between Bret and Owen. Yeah. This, I thought they just cut very small picture-in-picture, just showed her looking mock concerned, and then cut back. And I thought that was great. That's all it needed. And the match spoke for itself. Talk about simplistic storytelling. We spoke about it in the Warrior versus Savage. This was even simpler. Bulldog wanted to challenge Hart, their family. Right, let's see what it's going to do to our family. It's simple storytelling. There's no long, convoluted storylines. It's just simplistic. And the match benefited from that. of course, it benefited the match greatly that Bulldog was English, and he came out to what can only be described as a hero's welcome. The roof was lifted off the Wembley Stadium with just unbelievable noise. Lennox Lewis came out as well to lead him out, which was amazing. I wanted to ask you something, by the way. Can you explain to me the need for the Scottish bagpipe players doing Scotland the Brave? Was that just to get Roddy Piper on the broadcast, or
no? Yes, we haven't mentioned that. I believe that was Roddy Piper was that was purely to get Roddy Piper on the broadcast. That was pretty much it.
I wasn't sure if it was just because Vince just thought, Scotland's England, it's the same place, let's just do Scotland the Brave. But yeah, overall, one of the all-time great matches. It's still the great testament to it is that it still stands up in today's viewing, where we're seeing a 5-star match every other week, in places like New Japan and things like that. This match, this is what you hold a candle to. This is the SummerSlam match that everyone tries to beat.
Yes.
And it's a glowing sort of indictment of Britain and how much they loved wrestling at the time and how much the golden era of wrestling meant in Britain at the time. It's just a shame that it wouldn't last for much longer, because obviously in 1993 with the steroid trial and everything, things would start to go downhill very, very quickly for the WWF.
Yeah, but I absolutely love this. And watching it back this week, it brought back so many fond memories. And like I say, the crowd were the 11th man in this match, and they really, really kind of cheered Davey to glory, and the place erupted when that 3 count happened. And yeah, it was a perfect match. Absolutely loved it. It had psychology, it had drama. It had some fantastic wrestling action as well, a great ending, and let's say a good. I thought Bret Hart just deserves so much credit for how he pieced together this match on the fly, but regardless of whatever plan they had originally, and whatever conversation they had the night before this match. As we know, Bret Hart did have to kind of walk Davey Boy through the entire match. And, you couldn't really tell. It was a good match. I thought Davey Boy Smith, although he may not have been fully, in the land of the living before or during this match, he besides looking a bit gassed at some points, as you rightly mentioned, I thought that he played his part well as well. And it was a tremendous champion. Unfortunately, they didn't keep the title on him for too much longer. I think he dropped the title to Shawn Michaels later on in 1992, and I think they had a match at Survivor Series 92 as well, if I'm not mistaken. But Davey Boy could never quite get the better of Shawn Michaels throughout their little feud there. But let's get to some listener questions anyway, Rob, because we've had a few, and they are kind of interested to know our thoughts on one or two things in relation to SummerSlam 92. First of all, John Scott from WrestleLine. He said he must have been there. I've had many conversations with John, but we haven't kind of spoken about SummerSlam 92. So next time I speak to John, we'll have to kind of discuss that. But he says he can remember being there like it was yesterday. And then Ashley Clements, he asks, probably going to be the main question, do you think that we will get a big pay-per-view back over here in the UK in the future? So we did briefly touch on it at the top of the show then, Rob. I mean, I'm going to throw it to you first of all. I mean, what's your thoughts on WWE, not necessarily in the current climate, but, a few years down the line? Is there a possibility that we could see a SummerSlam again, maybe a Royal Rumble, dare I say it, a WrestleMania? Any thoughts on that?
I would love to see a big pay-per-view. I'd love to see any pay-per-view in the UK. Here, you had a tailor-made storyline for putting it in England. I mean, they moved it to England, I think, in May, and the show aired in August. And you had that ready-made thing. You had that big British star and the British Bulldog. Yeah. I think at the moment, obviously, we now have Drew. Whether that's a big enough thing to move an entire pay-per-view to England, I think it's the perfect time to do it, if I'm perfectly honest. Give Drew a nice long run with the title, have him lose it, have him win it back in England. It makes perfect sense. He's going to prove during this run that he is a top contender. Have him beat someone in England at Wembley Stadium again. Why not? In Hampden Park in Scotland. Why not? You've got that enormous pop just waiting to happen. There's so many people, no matter how bad the current day product is, you are always going to have, you announce a pay-per-view in England, the tickets will go within 20 minutes, guaranteed. If it's a Mania, 5.
Yeah.
People in this country just want to see wrestling, and that's, I mean, me and the Podmania lads we've been to both the UK takeovers in Blackpool, and the tickets went within 10 minutes, and that's for an NXT UK takeover in Blackpool in January. It's freezing in Blackpool in January. I don't know if anyone's ever been. It's absolutely freezing. It's like a ghost town, but it was incredible. That just goes to show the British love of wrestling. There's lots of contributing factors, you know, the time delay airing it to the US, things like that. I don't know. I can't give a definitive answer. Would have won one? Absolutely. God, yes. Do I think that we won? And maybe 60-40 towards a yes. Will it be a WrestleMania? No. I don't think it'll be anything as big as that.
Yeah. Now that they've made a big star of Drew, you know, over the next year or two, they'd be fools not to capitalise on that with the UK tour, dare I say it, possibly a bigger show than that. Maybe putting on, maybe not a WrestleMania, but bringing us, you know, a Royal Rumble or maybe a SummerSlam back to Wembley, Hampden Park. Why not? But yes, I mean, them tickets would sell like hotcakes, to be honest with you. And I think they got an opportunity to really push and promote Drew as the next British hero, as the next British Bulldog, dare I say it. But they've got something quite special there, and especially if they want to capitalise on the new deal with BT Sports, and you know the popularity of pro wrestling over in the UK and Europe is still very much so. It's still very, you know, definitely there. Although fans have kind of cooled off quite a bit on the WWE product, the appetite for pro wrestling, especially with a brand such as the WWE, if they were to come over here for a big show, would definitely be there. I mean, I have read that the reason why they haven't put a WrestleMania on over here in the UK is possibly because of financials as well. I know that a lot of cities over in the States, they actually bid to have WrestleMania take place in their town, in their state, in their city, and that you know, UK or London wouldn't be prepared to bid for a sporting event like that. So you know, that it could come down to dollars and cents, but when you listen to Triple H interviews, you know, he always, you know, treads the line very, very carefully. But I know, listening to Triple H's words and reading between the lines, that he can see the benefits of possibly having a European pay-per-view or a UK pay-per-view, and that the audience is there, the appetite is there. He's been over to the UK doing the UK takeovers. I've been to a couple myself, the one in Cardiff last August, and I was there in Blackpool this January as well, Rob. And yes, it was bloody cold. It was freezing. It was absolutely bitter. Walking, first we walked from the venue to a restaurant and then back to our hotel. And boy, we were glad to get inside. But I think Triple H has got the appetite to do something outside of North America. He can see the appeal and he can see, you know, the potential in doing something like that. But then, you know, Triple H is kind of not the last person in line when it comes to making the decisions. But, you know, Vince McMahon, you know, if he's reminded, and we've the British Bulldog hopefully going into the Hall of Fame at SummerSlam or sometime this year, was due to be going in over WrestleMania weekend. It will remind everybody, including Vince McMahon, of what a fantastic occasion SummerSlam 92 was, and what a momentous occasion it was for UK wrestling fans, for fans of the British Bulldog, for the family of you know, the Harts and the Smiths at the time, and you know, hopefully that might kind of rekindle fond memories of Vince McMahon and make him consider possibly putting a big pay-per-view over here in the UK sometime in the future. I think it's got to happen eventually. It's got to happen eventually.
Well, as well, don't forget, we are approaching 30-year anniversary of the show. 2022 marks the 30th anniversary of the show. What a wonderful fairy tale to come back 30 years later and do the same show at Wembley again. And we all know how much Vince is a sucker for, you know, an anniversary or a tagline. You know, look at the WrestleMania 20, which was all grown up, or was that WrestleMania 20? It was one of those WrestleManias. It was an awful tagline. But you can just see them, you know, 30 years on or something like that. And you can almost see now the stare off between Bret Bret and Davey Boy, and it's sort of, fizzling out into Drew staring off with, I don't know, Brock or something like that. You can really see that, and you can see them already. You can already see the sort of the graphics that will go along with that. I think that will be a perfect opportunity to do it.
Definitely. Let's move on to the next question then from Rob Mark, and he asks, with Bret and Davey Boy Smith being classed as one of the all-time greats, what is the best SummerSlam match in your opinion? So I kind of had a little think about this, and I've created a bit of a list, but you've obviously got Bret Hart versus Mr. Perfect from SummerSlam 91, a really fantastic match between two technical wizards, you could say. The Rock versus Brock Lesnar from 2002. Even Shawn Michaels versus Razor Ramon in their kind of ladder match rematch from WrestleMania 10 that took place at SummerSlam 95. But for me, I think the best SummerSlam match was, of course, Bret Hart versus Davey Boy Smith. But if I were to choose a close second to that, it would have to be Daniel Bryan versus John Cena for the WWE Championship at SummerSlam 2013. Absolutely loved that. Loved the fact that Daniel Bryan was a class as a bit of an equal to John Cena during the match and actually won the match. And then, of course, we had the horrible kind of moment where Triple H was the referee and turned on Daniel Bryan, and Randy Orton came in and cashed in and took the title away from Bryan. But Rob, what about yourself? If it had to be another match other than Davey Boy and Bret Hart, what would you choose as your favourite SummerSlam match?
I mean, the more you think about it, the more that you realise there are some fantastic matches. I mean, SummerSlam is often seen as, the red-headed stepchild of the Big Four. It's often sort of scooted away under the carpet because it hasn't got the stipulation that the Royal Rumble has, or even the Survivor Series has now. But you look at the match. I mean, this obviously it's got to be top three, if not number one. But there's Shawn Michaels versus Triple H from 2002. I thought that was absolutely unbelievable.
Street fight.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Even Shawn wrestling in jeans, absolutely fantastic. The fact that was Shawn's first match back in goodness knows how long, and the fact that it led to the run that it led to, it led to those fantastic matches with The Undertaker and so on. I thought that was amazing. Mysterio versus Kurt Angle from the same show, one of the greatest SummerSlam openers. And then Owen versus Bret, the steel cage match from 1994. If ever there was a one-match show, it certainly was SummerSlam 1994. But that was another absolutely sensational story told by Bret Hart, and I think if we've learnt anything from this show, it's that Bret Hart there's a reason he's called the excellence of execution, and I think he's proved it over this show, certainly managing to call one of the greatest matches in history effectively on the fly with his coked up brother-in-law.
Indeed. I mean, some of the matches I had on my list, some notable mentions. You had the first ever TLC match at a SummerSlam as well. Remember the Hardys versus the Dudleys versus Edge and Christian at SummerSlam 2000. You had Brock versus CM Punk in that no disqualification masterpiece, SummerSlam 2013. So the 2013 SummerSlam was excellent with Brock and CM Punk, and then Daniel Bryan versus John Cena. Of course, you mentioned about the Triple H Shawn Michaels street fight. So yeah, I mean, there's easily a dozen or more classic 4.5, 5-star matches that you can go out and watch. But before you do, switch on the network, watch SummerSlam 92, watch that main event, and just be prepared to be, have your socks blown off by the masterpiece that's put together by Bret Hart. And of course, that's a very memorable ending with Davey Boy Smith as the new Intercontinental Champion. But what would be your kind of overall thoughts of SummerSlam 92? What were some of the biggest takeaway moments for you, Rob, from the show?
Matches that I'd absolutely recommend you go and watch. And that, of course, is the main event that we've spoken about. And I also thought the Randy Savage vs. Ultimate Warrior match was fantastic. I actually enjoyed it, like I said before, a lot more than I originally thought I would. I'm not Ultimate Warrior's biggest fan in ring, and that's, but this was great. And it was a simple story, a story you don't need any background to. It's all done very, very well throughout the pay-per-view. Other than that, there are matches that might qualify for WWF's worst ever. I mean, the Virgil versus Nails one, which we've referenced a couple of times on this podcast, is just the, how can I put it nicely? It's the drizzling shits. It's awful. And then the Undertaker versus Kamala match, dreadful. You do not need to go out and see that. Maybe turn it on for his entrance, but apart from that, avoid it like the plague. But yeah, it's a 2-match show, but good God, those 2 matches are worth it.
For me, it's the entrances. I think that all of the entrances delivered because of being in Wembley Stadium and the grandeur of it all, and especially when you look at the Undertaker's entrance, for example, or Shawn Michaels' entrance, LOD's entrance, regardless of whether Rocco is strapped to the front of one of the bikes or not. But the entrances were absolutely fantastic, and I think that going back to one of the questions that we were asked about hosting a future WWE pay-per-view over in the UK, that's what you get. You get the raucous fans, 80,000 of them, potentially at Wembley Stadium, and the entrances will be phenomenal because of just the pop that they're going to get. But loved all of that. I enjoyed aspects of certain matches. I enjoyed aspects of the Shawn Michaels Rick Martel match. I enjoyed aspects of the Beverley Brothers versus the Natural Disasters, because it was nice to see the Beverley Brothers in a featured match on a big pay-per-view like this. I thought the Undertaker versus Kamala match was better than I remembered, believe it or not. I know you weren't a fan of it, but I kind of looking back, it's like the Undertaker versus Giant Gonzalez when I watched it back the other week with Mike, and I thought, okay, not as bad as I remember, but maybe my mind is just changing as I kind of head into the 40s. But yeah, so there were some bits that I remember better watching it back with a fresh pair of eyes now than 28 years ago. But yeah, it's still a very, very memorable show. And you've also got to think, the commentary duo of Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan. There were some classic lines that came out during the broadcast, and Bobby Heenan, as always, is golden on commentary. But yeah, I mean, it was a good show. But like you say, the 2 matches that stand out were the WWF Championship match and the main event for the Intercontinental title. But yeah, it's really just a 2-match show. But that Intercontinental title match, I think whenever anybody mentions SummerSlam, their mind automatically goes back to that match 9 times out of 10. There was a big list of matches that we just read off that could be the greatest SummerSlam match of all time. But in my opinion, Bret Hart versus Davey Boy Smith is the best SummerSlam match of all time. Yes, I might be biased because I was there. I absolutely loved it, but I think that you'd be hard pressed to find a wrestling fan that would, disagree with me, or like you say, possibly not have it in the top 2 or 3 at the very, very least. But yeah, Rob, it was incredible speaking to you here on the Wrestling with Johners podcast. Fantastic to have you on eventually, finally. And we spoke about SummerSlam 92, one of my favourite pay-per-views of all time. But before we say goodbye to you, first of all, I want to thank you and give you an opportunity to throw out any plugs, any social media handles you have for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever we can find you. Reach out to you, say hi, and learn more about Podmania and all the good things that you guys do. So your opportunity to throw out some plugs, sir.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, John. So you can find us on the website, www.podmania.co.uk. We've got all our podcasts archived there, whether it's Wrestling with Johners, whether it's the Podmania podcast, whether it's, our Young Lion cast, where we do a fortnightly New Japan Pro Wrestling podcast, whether it's the Stardom cast that we do monthly. It's also got our match rating archive, where we rate all the matches. You can see ratings from all sorts of classic matches, including most of the WrestleManias, I believe now. You can talk to us on Twitter at Podmania. Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google, Castbox, we're Stitcher, we're there, we're everywhere, to be perfectly honest. Twitter at Podmania, like I say, Facebook at Podmania Podcasts, and you can also subscribe to us on YouTube at The Real Podmania. I think that's everything. I could be wrong, but If
We'll
not, never
try to
mind.
get some of those links in the description to this episode. So if you are interested to learn more about Podmania and say hi to Rob and the guys and to listen to all of their fantastic content, and of course we're part of their network as well, then just click into the description of this episode and click on the links and go and say hi and like and subscribe and listen to all their great stuff. But Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today and reliving SummerSlam 92, and I always enjoyed doing these retro pay-per-view reviews, and I never thought that I'll be doing a SummerSlam 92 review this this time, but it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you, sir.
Not a problem at all. Thank you for having me. I hope we can do this again soon.
Most definitely. So there we go. Please keep it tuned to the Wrestling with Johners podcast. And if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please don't forget to spread the word. Tell your friends and tell your family. Don't forget to hit that ever important subscribe button so that you can be notified every time a new episode drops. Once again, thank you to Rob for coming on the Wrestling with Johners podcast. Thanks to everybody for listening. Have yourself a great weekend and a great week. And we'll catch up with you all again soon.